This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
We welcome you to Ascertaining Bible Authority, our study session number 4. We're in an area which I am calling significant distinctions. That is, there are certain distinctions that have to be made. These have to be in our mind, clearly in our mind, in order for us to proceed with the matter, understand the matter of ascertaining Bible authority. We've talked about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We've talked about the difference between patriarchy and Judaism and New Testament Christianity. We've glanced at the matter of the distinction that has to be made between faith and opinion. We have, in the previous session, discussed matters that were temporary in their very nature as distinguished from the permanent. And we pick up right at that particular point and express another thought or two in that connection. We did stress that in the early church in New Testament Christianity, there was such a thing as the miraculous measure of the Holy Spirit, and thus the spiritual gifts. And yet, if I were to say to you that you must desire earnestly the spiritual gifts, and if you were to respond by saying, now, Brother Devo, what passage says so? And if I were to cite 1 Corinthians 14, verse 1, which says that precisely, I would be misapplying 1 Corinthians 14, 1, because that very statement, desire earnestly spiritual gifts, is made in the context recognizing there was such a thing as the miraculous spiritual gifts. But there is now no such thing as the miraculous spiritual gifts. The Bible itself emphasizes that these spiritual gifts were given for a distinct purpose, for a limited time. The purpose was achieved. The time expired. The miraculous element ceased to be. Now, how do we know all of these things? We must know these things, and we obtain this information by proper, careful consideration of the totality of the Bible teaching on the matter at hand. And in fact, that's a basic, solid, rock-bottom point of Bible study. We must always be able to obtain all of the information, the totality of the Bible teaching on their matter at hand. You remember in the Lord's encounter with the devil quoted the Scripture, and so far as I can tell, he quoted it accurately, but he took it out of context and misapplied it, and the Lord said to him, again it is written. Write down on your notepad, or especially the notepad and the tablets of your own mind, the Lord's statement, again it is written. That is, the Lord stressed in this matter the importance of obtaining the totality of the Bible teaching on any subject matter. That's what was written, but again, here's something else that relates to that, which has to fit in with that. And so that a great and simple and profound Bible principle. But another distinction we need to recognize, must recognize, is the difference the Bible itself makes between circumstance and condition. In striving to learn about our duties and our responsibilities and our obligations and the attitudes that God requires of us, we must distinguish clearly between circumstances and conditions. In this regard, may we cite Acts 16, verses 13 through 15. Here we have the record of the conversion of Lydia and of her household. The record says, and on the Sabbath day we went forth without or outside the gate by a river side, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spake unto the women that were come together. And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, one that worshipped God, heard us. Lydia heard us, whose heart the Lord opened to give heed unto the things which were spoken by Paul. And when she was baptized, and her household, she besought us, saying, If ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And Luke, the sacred writer here, says, and she constrained us, she compelled us, she insisted that we use her home as a meeting place. And so the matters of Sabbath day, a place of prayer, sitting down, meeting of women, these were circumstances. The preaching, the hearing, the believing, the baptism, these were conditions. Circumstances vary, conditions do not. We must be able to distinguish between the circumstances and the conditions that are specified and set out. In Acts 16, we also have the record of the conversion of the jailer and of his household. The imprisonment, Paul and Silas in the prison, their feet being fastened in stocks, the praying and the singing at midnight, the prisoners listening, the great earthquake, the shaking of the foundations, the open doors, the loosened bands. These were all interesting circumstances related to this conversion, but these were not conditions of salvation. The preaching, the hearing, the believing, the baptism, these were conditions for the jailer's salvation and that of his household. These conditions were essential. We maintain that it's not difficult to distinguish between circumstance and condition. In this regard, we suggest that common sense is certainly a vital factor. Circumstances differ, conditions do not. Then we must be able to distinguish between the incidental and the essential. This is an important distinction and somewhat overlaps the matter of conditions and circumstances. We recognize that in this area of consideration, there is this overlapping with the matter of circumstance and condition. In some cases, the incidental may be involved in the circumstance, but in some cases, the essential, something that was essential under those circumstances, will not be a condition related to man's salvation. For example, in Acts 16, verse 10, we have the record of the great Macedonian call, the call from God to Paul in connection with preaching in Macedonia. God made it clear that he wanted Paul to preach the gospel in Macedonia. Dr. Luke, the beloved physician, and by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, says in recording the details, setting sail, therefore, from Troas, we made a straight course to Samothrace, and the day following to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi, which is a city of Macedonia, the first of the district, a Roman colony, and we were in this city tarrying certain days. End of that reading. And going to Macedonia, Paul and his company chose to travel by ship. They could have followed the land route. The essential thing was, according to God's requirement, go into Macedonia. Traveling by ship was purely incidental. According to Acts 20, verses 7 through 9, the brethren of Troas met for worship on the third floor of a building. Obviously, the fact of the meeting place, or the fact that the meeting place was on the third floor, had nothing to do with acceptable worship. They could have worshiped on the first floor if it had been available, or on the second floor if a place had been available, or on a fifth floor. The essential thing was worship God as God directs. The incidental thing was third story. And so we must always be careful to distinguish between the incidental and the essential. Now I want us to look at a section that I would call distinguishing between the principle set out in the record of a certain event and the means by which that principle is set out. We must be able to distinguish between means and principle. And it's at this point that many, many mistakes have been made. We must distinguish clearly between means and the principle. Sometimes we become so involved in consideration of the means by which a principle is set out that we fail to understand what the principle is. We can become so concerned about the forest that we fail to see a tree, for example, that we're supposed to be concentrating upon. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 14, verses 26 through 40, a section of Scripture that not only has in the past given, but still gives many, many people a great deal of difficulty. This subject area, or this particular text area, comes within the scope of the Bible's amazing discussion, one of the major discussions on the subject of spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians chapters 12 and 13 and 14. All three of those chapters are on that particular subject matter. And if you forget the chapter divisions there and just read the totality of the context, that point is made crystal clear. All right, in this, Paul is discussing the subject matter of spiritual gifts. Chapter 14, verses 26 through 40, we're in the context of that discussion of spiritual gifts, which began back in chapter 12, verse 1. There were no chapters when these lines were first written. The attempt to study 1 Corinthians 14, 26 through 40, without due consideration to the context, has produced tragic consequences among brethren. In fact, there are many brethren who are able to quote verse 34, and I've caught them at this matter, able to quote verse 34 who have no idea as to what's in verse 26. In these verses, Paul discusses a meeting of brethren, a special meeting of brethren in Corinth, a very special meeting of brethren in Corinth. It was a meeting for the purpose of receiving the benefits of spiritual gifts, a meeting in which the spiritual gifts were exercised, and a meeting in which there were to those present the benefits of these spiritual gifts, which of course in time would be carried to the totality of the congregation, the entire congregation. But these in this meeting were therefore exercising and receiving the benefits in God's power and providence and God's plan, the benefits of these miraculous gifts. This is not the same kind of meeting for the regular Lord's Day worship in which the supper is observed. That meeting was dealt with in chapter 11. This is a different meeting entirely. A meeting for the purpose of receiving the benefits of the spiritual gifts. It was a meeting of brethren only. How is it then, brethren, when ye, brethren, come together? I don't find anybody there excepting members of the body of Christ in this meeting. Paul gives specific instructions about those and to those who would exercise the gift of tongues, about those and to those who would exercise the gift of interpretation of tongues, about those men who possessed and who would exercise the gift of prophecy, and with regard to the conduct of the prophets' wives in this kind of a meeting. With particular regard to the kind of meeting under consideration, Paul mentions specifically two conditions in which men, mind you, were instructed to keep silence. Verse 28, And verse 30, circumstances in which men were enjoined to keep silence in that meeting. If there's in that meeting someone who has the gift of tongues, for example, this miraculous gift, not talking about a jabbering, that's not the use of the word tongues in the New Testament, but he possesses the gift of tongues and would exercise that gift, but for one factor. Perhaps there's no one present who has the miraculous gift of interpretation of tongues. And under those circumstances, Paul commands that the man who would otherwise exercise the gift of tongues is not to do so. He is to remain silent because there isn't anyone there to interpret the tongues. That's condition number one. Or we're talking about prophets, men through whom God revealed His will. And if prophet number one is up speaking, it's God's message, not his, but he is speaking. And if God gives a revelation to prophet number two, perhaps sitting nearby or on the front, then the instruction is let the man who's doing the talking, let him be quiet. The other man has received a revelation. That doesn't mean that this man can't stop. Wouldn't do any good for him to say, well, I'm a prophet, I'm speaking God's will, this is God's revelation, I can't quit. The other man couldn't say, well, I'm a prophet, I've received a revelation, and so I've got to start. That would cause confusion, and Paul says that's not the way it is. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. Let the man, if another man receives a revelation, let the one who's doing the speaking keep silence. And yet I have met men in public debate who knew about the injunction for a woman to keep silent in this meeting under certain circumstances, but who didn't know anything in the world about these conditions in which men, two conditions in which men are enjoined to keep silence in these meetings. Paul explains about these women, let your women, the women of you, the women of these prophets, and therefore we take it the prophets' wives, the wives of these men, let these keep silence under these circumstances. Paul explains it is not permitted unto them to speak. They're not to break the silence. Laleo, they are not to break the silence at all in this meeting. So obviously it's not a meeting. We'll come on to that in just a moment. Not a meeting like our regular worship services. Not permitted unto them to speak, and Paul says, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in the church or in assembly, especially to violate these circumstances in this kind of an assembly. But now let's pass on hurriedly. In our regular worship assemblies, our women are allowed to sing. And in fact, they are commanded to sing. And thus we do our duty when we encourage them to sing. And when they sing, they speak. And when they speak, when they sing, they teach. But they're not in violation of God's will, because our regular worship assemblies and this assembly in 1 Corinthians 14, 26 through 40 are entirely different assemblies. Women are allowed to come forward in our regular assemblies, to stand before the assembly and confess their faith in the Christ, that they might be baptized, without in any way violating this statement in 1 Corinthians 14, let your women keep silent. In fact, women are allowed in our regular services to confess their sins in genuine repentance, that they may be forgiven, and that without being in violation of the divine injunction, let them keep silence. All this without sin, without shame. Obviously, our meetings, our regular worship assemblies, and this kind of meeting talked about in 1 Corinthians 14, 26 through 40, are not the same kind of meeting at all. Well, does this mean then? I've had the question come lots of times, does this mean that 1 Corinthians 14, 26 through 40 has no application to the church today? Doesn't mean that at all. We're talking about being able to distinguish between the principles and the means by which the principles are set out. Well, what are the principles that are set forth? Whatever they are, we mark it well that these principles are just as binding now as they ever were. The means, the circumstances, the situation by which Paul set forth these principles do not exist in our world today. The binding principles are these: let all things be done unto edifying. Another binding principle is God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. Another, let them be in subjection. That's a principle that is still binding upon women, just as old as the Garden of Eden. And that's the reason why inspiration in the New Testament sets out and explains that injunction. Adam was first formed, and then Eve. Doesn't mean inferiority, but it does mean an attitude of subjection. Let them be in subjection. And then the sacred principle, let all things be done decently and in order, especially in this context, would mean in harmony with God's ordained will. We must be careful to distinguish between the principle and the means by which the principle is set out. And a similar point, and yet so different that it deserves careful consideration, we must be able to distinguish between custom and law. Custom and divine law. We must be able to distinguish between the human custom and divine law. I believe that this, brethren and friends, is the real key to understanding the material we have in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 through 16 in particular. Much of what is said in these verses relates to the custom prevalent in Corinth, the custom of the woman wearing the veil, and the wearing of the veil having certain significance in Corinth that it does not have, at least in our part of the world, this day. It is my personal conviction, for whatever it's worth or not worth, that Paul in these verses does not teach that all Christian women, when appearing in public or in public worship assemblies, at all times and in all places, must wear the veil. Paul in these verses, and in consideration of a particular custom, does emphasize certain sacred principles which are just as binding now as they were then. Well, what are these sacred principles? From these verses, carefully studied, we learn that the head of Christ is God. That was true then, that's true now. The head of every man is Christ. That was true then, that's true now. The head of the woman is the man. That was true then, that's true now. The principle is just as binding as it ever was. Secondly, we learn that the man is to do nothing which will bring dishonor to the Christ. The man is to seek always, by words, by acts, by life, to bring honor to the Christ. That was true then, it's true now. We learn that the woman is to do nothing which will bring a dishonor to the man. She's to maintain an attitude of respect and subordination. That was true then, it's true now. I learn in the fourth place that it's right and good to be in harmony with the customs which are right within themselves. We should not offend others by violating these customs which are right within themselves. I learned further that we should not bring reproach upon or criticism upon the church of the Lord by violating customs which are all right within themselves. I learned in the sixth place that we must not dress in such fashion as to become identified with impure people. Number 7, I learned that we must not dress in such fashion as to be offensive to God or to His angels, I presume, are present in regular worship assemblies. Our dress, I learned number 8, that our dress must indicate a deep and abiding concern about purity and decency. I remember preaching on this many, many years ago. I think this is in the book. Our Ascertaining Bible Authority book as an illustration. Yes, I know it is. It's on page 81 and following. But I remember saying in that lesson upon that occasion, as we were dealing with efforts to try to help us all to have a better understanding of 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, I stressed the point that if the time ever comes in which the impure women of Tarrant County identify themselves by wearing a red purse on the left arm, then I will get into this pulpit and I will preach from this pulpit that at least in our area it's a sin for a woman to wear a red purse on her left arm. There's the principle that was set out and the principle we must respect. Another matter that deserves some attention right now is simply this: we must be able and be careful to distinguish between who said that. I guess that's always a good principle to keep in mind in studying the Bible, the simple principle of hermeneutics, how to study the Bible in this context. Who said this? It's easy to make a mistake of saying the Bible says thus and so, when the Bible doesn't say that at all. Oh, but I can turn and read the words right here. Oh, yes, I can too. But I've got to read everything that's there, or at least the context. Consider for a moment the friends of Job, and with friends like that, no one needed enemies. But I guess they were really trying to help. But they said many things which are written in the book of Job. You and I turn and read these things, and unless we're careful, you or I, or perhaps our friends and neighbors, will read these and say, now look, here's what the book of Job says. When the book of Job is not teaching that at all, that's what Job's friends have said, and God himself told Job later that Job was right and the friends were wrong. I've got to understand who said it. I think all of my life I've heard it said from time to time that God doesn't hear sinners pray. And the documentation is invariably John 9:31. Well, I can turn to John 9:31, and I can read the statement, we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and do his will, him he heareth. But I go back up to verse 30, and it says, the man answered. Well, this is not the Lord talking at all. This is what that man said. What man? The man to whom the Lord had given sight, the man whose blindness the Lord had cured, the one who had been healed. And he was having a great deal of trouble with these Jews. They were making false accusations against him, and he was quite a logician. You don't know who this man is, and yet he opened mine eyes. That demands some consideration. And then the man himself goes on to say, we know that God heareth not sinners. He's the one that said that. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm saying he's the one that said it. Whether that's a truth from God or not has to be determined by some other consideration. The totality of the subject matter, that particular subject matter. Here's what the man said, and if he's right, and I know that there are some Old Testament passages as well as a New Testament reference or two that indicate that very point. But my point is now, be careful to consider the context. Who said that? I drop down in that same context to verse 34. Now that's the Jews talking to this man who had been healed. They answered and said unto him, thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. Well, these Jews said, thou wast altogether born in sin. And some conclude that a child is born a sinner. But that isn't true. Nowhere in the Bible does it teach that a child, an infant, is born in sin. It does teach that all people, all infants, are born into a world of sin. But it's only the accountable person who can become a transgressor of God's will, and that's when and where and how a person becomes a sinner. But they said that. You can turn and read that. They said thou wast altogether born in sin, but the fact that they said it didn't make it right. In fact, it's definitely wrong. So I must be careful to recognize the difference between the statements from inspired men and the statements from non-inspired men. Now, what's true about John 9, whether it's 31 or 34? Here is the divine record. Take the record of what the man said. Here's what he said. We know that God heareth not sinners. Well, that's the divine record of what he said. But the divine record of what he said doesn't mean that that's God's truth on the subject. And we must be careful to distinguish between the inspired record and the inspired message. Well, perhaps that's enough along that line. These are significant distinctions that we must be able to make. Not because we are determined to make arbitrary distinctions. We want to recognize and respect the distinctions that God himself does make. Now let's go to another area. And here we're going to look at actions and obligations. And this material is in the little book. We are to contemplate, or as we contemplate Bible authority, at this time we have in mind the scriptural authority underlying our actions and our attitudes as Christians. Our actions are the product of our attitude. Our actions grow out of our obligation. Our obligations as children of God relate to one basic point. And that one big, great and basic point is the salvation of the souls of men. The Son of Man came to seek and to save that which is lost. The word Jesus itself, thou shalt call his name Jesus, Jesus, because it is he that shall save his people from their sins. Suppose we contemplate momentarily here the mission of the Church of the Lord. I would suggest to us, or at least remind us, that we are to carry the gospel. We have the great privilege and the obligation of carrying the gospel to every creature in the whole world. The Lord gave that commission to those 11 men that stood upon that mountain of Galilee, as recorded in Matthew 28, verses 18 and following. And we likewise work under the authority of that commission and the charge of going into all the world to preach the gospel to every creature. The church of the Lord, individuals who make up the church in the aggregate sense. We're to carry the gospel to every creature. Furthermore, we are to help the deserving needy. We use the word benevolence in that connection real often, and it's a good word. But we are to help the deserving and needy. And another aspect of the work of the local congregation or the church of the Lord is to edify the saints, edify each other. We're concerned about each other, helping each other, strengthening each other, weeping with those that weep, rejoicing with those that rejoice, striving constantly to help each other as we go and as we grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. So these are specific or great general, let's call them general obligations that relate to this matter. But I want to come back to that. In connection with the carrying out of these general obligations, there are numerous specific works. In carrying the gospel, you might conduct a gospel meeting. You might preach in the pulpit where you serve as the local preacher. You might teach a Bible class. You might conduct a class in somebody's home. Or from night to night, day by day, you might be teaching the Bible to someone individually or perhaps a family unit. These are great ways. What about the newspaper? Use the newspaper, radio, television. These are various World Video Bible School. These are means by which we can do a better job in getting the whole gospel to the whole world. Specific works. And the matter of helping the needy, benevolence. Well, there are lots of different ways of doing the benevolent work. Carrying a basket of groceries to a deserving needy family or a deserving needy needy family or a person. Helping pay a certain bill because someone's behind in the bills. On and on. But there is an evangelistic thrust even in this. And may God help us never to forget it. Even so, said the Lord, let your light so shine before men that others may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And if the person, the outsider, by the beholding of your good works, can be led in time to obey the gospel of the Christ, to bring honor and glory to the Father, that is evangelism, whether we use that particular term or not. We ought to carry the gospel, we ought to help the needy, and we ought to edify the saints. Gospel preaching involves that. The elders and their responsibility in feeding the flock, that's involved in all of that. Bible studies in the home, Bible studies in our classes, encouraging brethren to work together in teaching their children, and in studying together as a family unit. These are different aspects. We're simply saying there are numerous specific works. How many of these? I have no idea. I remember many years ago in working with the church in Hanley, East Fort Worth, that I listed for myself, my own benefit, 169 different specific activities in which we were involved as a congregation, coming under the heading of the specific works. But the specific works tie on to carrying the gospel, and the specific works tie on to helping the needy, tie on to edifying the saints, and then each of these ties on to the mission of the church, the salvation of the souls of men. To this end we carry the gospel. To this end we help the needy. To this end we edify the saints. So we're saying we need to understand the mission of the church. Understand our obligation. Now when we understand our obligations, that gets us into the area of our attitudes and our responsibilities to meet our obligation. And so we have to be concerned about specific details in that regard. But may God help us to understand that our obligation is the salvation of souls. This is the God-given mission of the Lord's church, the salvation of the souls of men. And the basic obligation of saving souls involves these general obligations of carrying the gospel, helping the needy, and edifying the church. Now then, in each of these, there are specific tasks that must be performed, and as to whether or not we will meet these obligations, if we expect to be pleasing in God's sight, we have no choice. But with reference to how we meet the obligation, there are areas of choice. And that brings us back to town to some remarks we made earlier about optional matters, and also about matters of expediency. And an expediency comes within the scope of the optional matters. But how is the Bible authority established with reference to what our obligations are, and how is authority established with reference to how we are to meet these obligations? And so from that point and upon that background, we're going to begin to study. We don't have much time left to do it right now, but we will continue that in our next session. We want to study the fact that the Bible authorizes by means of example. Now let's ponder the point or the question, exactly what is an example? And when we use the word example, what do we have in mind? The word example means, according to the dictionary, that which is to be followed, comma, or imitated, semicolon, a pattern. Did you observe that? An example is that which is to be followed. We mentioned this definition to point out that an example is to be followed, is to be imitated. That is the very meaning of the word. And so if it is an example, it is binding. Tens of thousands of times I've heard the question raised, when is an example binding? Brethren, if it is an example, it is binding. If it isn't binding, it's not an example. That's the very meaning of the word. And sometimes I have been somewhat reprimanded on that point. Someone says, but don't you understand that the closest friend you have upon this earth, Brother Thomas Warren, has written a book which he calls When is an Example Binding? I said, yes, I know that. And I also know that he knows that better than anybody else. But have you ever noticed he has the word binding in quotation marks? He uses the title because that's the question that people are asking. But if it is an example, it is binding. If it's not binding, it's not an example. And we will come right back down to that point in another session.
This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.